Hello, I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of Australian Community Futures Planning. And this is part 2 of episode 2 in our series explaining National Integrated Planning and Reporting, or what I otherwise call how Australians can rise above politics and set the agenda for the nation's future. In episode 1 of this series, I set out some introductory context for National IP&R. I spoke about its purpose, why it's coming to the fore as an important means of strengthening democracy at the outset of the 2020s, and how it is already helping Australians build their first National Community Futures Plan, Australia Together. In the second episode, I began setting out how there are 8 main parts of the process of National IP&R, and I explained the first 4 of those. I also talked about how National IP&R can give Australians a more powerful voice in their own democracy, and how it's a time saver and a money saver. In this episode, I'm going to explain the element of National IP&R that is the money saver. It's about the 5th element, long-term financial planning for the government sectors and the taxpayers' participation in the wider national economy. The government sector is the biggest single player in Australia's economy, producing more than a quarter of the nation's wealth. But for more than 30 years now, Australians have been told that the best way they can improve their economy and their standard of living is to reduce the size of government. We've been told that the best way to save money is to restrict taxpayer participation in growing their own economy and to limit their enjoyment of returns from investment of their wealth as a nation. We've been told that privatisation of public assets and services is the key to saving money, that if we sell off everything taxpayers have built, we will be able to buy services more cheaply. Of course, after more than 30 years of that, we now know it hasn't worked. Prices have risen and we are getting less and less services for our money. Just look at your power bills. The reality is that privatisation is not a sure path to saving money, any more than retention of public ownership would be if competition for all players in the market, be they government or private, is not well regulated. And in Australia, markets are now very poorly regulated. Nor does privatisation protect the services we need. What saves money and protects services, private or public, is long-term financial planning. Currently, Australia does not do this for the biggest part of our economy, the sector owned by the taxpayer. This is irresponsibility on a grand scale. But with National Integrated Planning and Reporting, including the element of long-term national financial planning, we can sort this out. By this I mean everyday Australians can sort this out. This might seem like a big call, but in truth, Australians are the only ones who can sort it out. We can master this, and the rewards are extraordinary, much bigger than we could ever get from continued privatisation in poorly regulated markets. Long-term financial planning within National IP&R gives us the means to form a new relationship with our governments and make sure that elected parliaments have the guidance they need from us to create the kind of Australia we want, and our support in financing it. If we learn to do this well, it is the most rewarding part of the whole of National IP&R process, especially because it offers Australians the first opportunity we've ever had to have a much bigger say in how our taxes are gathered and used. So let's see how it works. National Integrated Planning and Reporting is designed as an efficient process that we can use together to produce Australia's first integrated National Community Futures Plan, Australia Together. But if we wish to maximise the benefits of a long-term plan like Australia Together, we need to work out how to fund it, particularly the taxpayers' contributions to it. So this element of National IP&R is designed to help Australians work out how to get more for their money in services and in returns on investment of their taxes. It's designed to help us learn how to ensure our taxes are spent on what we want and need, and that maximum returns come back to us as investors. When talking about targets and strategies in part 1 of this episode, I spoke about how national IP&R can free us from adversarial politics. But more than that, it can help us to stop politicians from cutting off our prospects of financing a better future. They cut off those prospects every day now by distracting us with tales of what we can and can't afford. Those tales always trap us back into thinking about what we can afford today in an effort to make us settle for that on an ongoing basis. But this sheds no light on how we can finance our future. So such tales are irrelevant in a long-term planning process, and in any case they're nearly always untrue. This is a very wealthy nation, and if we've learned anything from COVID-19, it's that countries like Australia can afford a lot more than we've been getting during the 2010s in the way of services, social safety nets, fiscal stimulus, infrastructure spending, and measures to reduce inequality and social exclusion. In effect, we have all the wealth and resources we need to finance a wonderful future by world standards. We just have to organise it so that this wealth is fairly raised and fairly shared. At the moment, wealth in Australia is raised unfairly and is shared inequitably, which in turn is reducing our total national economic growth. If the tax cuts we legislated in 2019 are implemented by their due date of 2024, we are set to become a country where wealth is raised even more unfairly than it is now. And in that arrangement, everyone in all but the top 20% of income earners will get smaller shares of even smaller total tax revenues. With national IP&R, Australians can reverse this. We can reset our financial future to make the most of the national wealth we all work hard to produce, and we can share it more equitably among ourselves now and with future generations. With integrated planning and reporting, we can already inject ourselves into long-term financial planning processes at the local government level. And this is something we can learn to do as a community at the national level. It's a financial planning skill that works in reverse to the way we currently set national and state budgets. To understand this, we need to have a brief look at how national and state governments currently do financial planning. As it stands now, the Australian Federal Government's Treasury Department prepares budgets only for the short term, basically for 1 year, with a few added projections and commitments of notional funding for initiatives in the ensuing 3 years, forward commitments which are ignored when the budget process starts again in the following year. This is, of course, a very important process because the federal budget controls the expenditures of taxation revenues. So it controls more than a quarter of the nation's annual income. It is the expenditure budget for the biggest single participant in the Australian economy by far, the taxpayer. But because of this mere 1 year time frame for how this massive portion of our wealth is to be spent, no one gets much, if any, advance notice about assessment of liabilities we know we are facing in the future and the financial provisions we should be making for those impending liabilities now. These liabilities include things like expenditures that will be necessary for infrastructure asset renewal or expenditures to meet growth and demand for essential services like health, education, transport and emergency response, or for expenditures like climate change mitigation, remediation and adaptation. Local government is now required to plan for these sorts of liabilities on a minimum 10-year time frame. State and federal governments are not. Some provisions are probably made for asset renewal at the federal and state levels, although we have to take it on trust that these bills are not being pushed onto future generations. But climate change liabilities are not reflected in or provided for in either federal or state budgets, and these are known now to amount to hundreds of billions of dollars, as the University of Melbourne has shown. If the world fails to prevent global heating from rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution temperatures, Melbourne Uni has calculated that the accumulated cost to Australia will be at least $584 billion,
by 2030. To give an idea of how big that risk is, it's over 100 billion more than the whole of the annual revenues in the federal budget in 2021. Clearly, we can't afford to let this blow out to the $762 billion cost identified by Melbourne Uni by 2050, especially as we have just more than doubled government debt due to the pandemic. We have taken on an estimated additional $657 billion in gross debt just to tide us over. This has been referred to by Australia's Treasurer Josh Frydenberg as an eye-watering amount of debt, but it is unavoidable. And if interest rates remain low and we improve both our productivity and equity in income distribution, and nothing else goes wrong like an interest rate rise, it is probably manageable. The climate debt, however, is a different story. It's still avoidable, and yet we are doing nothing to recognise this liability in our current budgets, let alone headed off by a policy change. Imagine what it will do to our quality of life if we don't change policy and if we subject ourselves to the climate change liability on top of the pandemic debt. Imagine our children trying to pay off both, especially if interest rates rise. Climate change is not the only area where future liabilities and probable risks are obfuscated or ignored in the federal budget. The federal government cannot take care of Australians by behaving in this way, and we simply shouldn't let them. National IP&R can help us stop this sort of gross irresponsibility. There is one place, however, where federal governments do make some attempt to take a longer-term view. Every 5 years, they are required by law to prepare an intergenerational report. This is an economic model attempting to indicate how healthy our economy will be in 40 years if current policies for expenditure of our taxation revenues are maintained as they are now. This is useful for economic theorists, and indeed it does assist analysts to provide advance notice to governments about some potential weaknesses in the economy, at least those that may arise from changes in population, productivity, participation by Australians in employment, and prices for what we produce. But when it comes to helping us grab or even identify the opportunities that would help us finance our future, it's largely useless. It can be worse than useless if it ignores things like the climate change liability I've just mentioned, which it does. But it can also be worse than useless, in other words, it can be outright harmful, if it is used to bake in cuts to vital services over generations. This is in fact exactly how the Intergenerational report has been used by the federal government since 2015. The Intergenerational report should be where we can see that adequate funds for our future are being put aside, at least for the really important things like our health, education, a social safety net, and protection from climate change. But buried in the detail is the fact that in 2021, there is no intention by the federal government to put enough aside to meet expected demand for these essential services and for known liabilities. Nor has there been such an intention since 2015. For instance, the federal government is planning to decrease the share of our GDP that we spend on our education. In fact, they're planning to cut it by almost 40% by 2061. Australians are expected to work hard to produce more, but they're getting smaller shares of it back for their education. They'll get nowhere near what they need if we are to produce workers capable of achieving growth in the productivity of their labour. It's the same with what the government calls working age payments, meaning payments to Australians for things like the disability support pension, job seeker unemployment benefits, parenting payments, carer payments, and youth allowance. Funding for these is projected to decline from 2.5% of GDP in 2021 to 1.9% of GDP in 2061, although this picture by Treasury doesn't foreground the full story of what is planned in cuts to our broader welfare, because it excludes what they're planning to cut in the family tax benefit, the childcare subsidy, and paid parental leave. These are all essential working age benefits that we currently enjoy in Australia, but they're slated for cuts. The cuts are not always cuts in absolute dollar terms, but in all but one case, they will be cut in terms of the share of GDP that is devoted to them. On this basis, they're to be almost halved. Fair sharing, this is not. In the 2021 Intergenerational report, it's expected that each Australian will work as hard in the next 40 years to produce almost as much growth in our economy as they did per capita in the last 40 years. But the shares that will be returned to them to support them in this endeavour and to maintain their quality of life will be much smaller. On this basis, the 2021 Intergenerational report could be aptly subtitled, "How Australians Will Work Harder but Live with Less." So much for our aspirations. In a small number of areas, our spending as a proportion of GDP is slated to increase. This applies to health, defence and aged care. But in the case of aged care, the planned increase in funding is to be paid for nonetheless by the aged. Pensions are slated to be reduced to offset the increased costs of aged care, and this at a time when superannuation balances will be low, because in 2020 the government allowed Australians to withdraw their superannuation balances during COVID-19. Many Australians took up this option, possibly thinking they will fall back on the pension in old age. But clearly, if we stick with the policies of the 2021 and 2015 intergenerational reports, the pension is not likely to be funded to the extent that will be necessary by 2061. Anyone happening to be in their 60s, 70s or 80s then is facing the prospect of very uncertain security. This is another example of how the intergenerational report is not a plan to take care of Australians. When it comes to our biggest item of expected spending, our health, this is set to increase, as is another big item, defence. But in the case of our health, the planned increase doesn't equate to the necessary full coverage. The federal government is planning to increase spending on health from 4.6% to 6.2% of GDP by 2061. But Treasury's own latest disclosed estimates of demand suggest that we will need to be spending at least 7.1% of GDP on our health by 2055. The last two intergenerational reports both track the nation towards much lower provisions for health than we are likely to need. It's a plan for creeping austerity and for verging towards the American system of unaffordable health care. And what gives the game away in the 2021 report is the neatly buried glib statement that governments will need to manage spending pressures by improving the efficiency of service delivery and ensuring support is targeted to those who need it most, particularly in health. It's impossible to imagine how we will decide who needs their health most and who would decide it. But what is clear is that, based on the way the last two intergenerational reports have been set up, the current federal government doesn't have the slightest intention of putting aside enough to maintain Australia's current standard of living, let alone cover our future needs. Nor does the intergenerational report take into account liabilities for climate change and its effect on our GDP growth, on the strength of our economy overall, and on the inequity of burden that will be placed on lower income Australians due to climate change. And since the federal government seems to have no intention of working out how to cope with all this, and no intention of restoring us to a position where we can equitably share the burdens and rewards for future production, we will need to work all this out for ourselves. The good news is we can. Anyone basically over the age of 15 can easily become involved in this. National IP&R gives us the means. So, how does long-term financial planning work in national IP&R? I said earlier that it's a financial planning skill that works in reverse to the way we currently set national and state budgets. These budgets are always set up so that the budget itself drives and constrains any plan or strategy that might, by luck, be funded under that budget. But in National IP&R, it's the other way around. The community's plan drives the budget. And by using National IP&R, we can produce this plan together to guide our long-term financial planning. In this arrangement, the federal government's annual budget is recognised for what it is. It's not a plan. It's just a description of an amount of money we're prepared to spend as a nation in a year. It's not an end in itself, which is how most governments like to treat budgets now, as though they provide evidence of a government's financial competence and economic management, particularly if they're budgets that are balanced or in surplus. Of course, a balanced federal budget is no testimony whatsoever of the skill of a government in providing for both our present essential needs and our sustainable economic future, especially if the balance is achieved by cutting vital services and ignoring imminent liabilities and risks. That is merely a demonstration of skill in inflicting avoidable pain and inequality on the nation. With National IP&R, however, the community sets the agenda for expenditures first. They set the full, integrated, long-term plan. And a Federal Treasury analyst's job is then simply to work out how to finance it in full over the longer term, but in a series of conversations with Australians. The existence of the community's plan gives Treasury the first chance it has ever had to find ways to achieve all that is essential for our well-being and security at the lowest long-run cost. Instead of just ruling things out like our good health or our education, because we think we can't afford them today, they can secure these things for us for the future. Long-term financial planning with National IP&R changes Treasury's job from one where they habitually resort to solving today's budget woes by telling us that we can't have even the essentials, to one where their primary role is to arrange the money for what we think is essential, and for anything else we decide we really need or would love to have and are therefore prepared to pay for. Treasury analysts can have the necessary conversations with us in stages. Stage 1 is to prepare estimates for a minimum of 10 years of annual costs for maintenance of existing service levels, including for the growing population, maintenance and renewal of existing assets, maintenance and renewal of essential new infrastructure, and financial liabilities, including for things like superannuation or interest payable on public debt. We would also need to include a cost estimate for imminent, foreseen and unavoidable liabilities, which at the moment would be mainly for the cost of failure to stop global heating. These cost estimates could be reduced or netted off by any policy changes that are already approved. In the case of climate change, if we had no such policies, we would probably need to recognise and include the University of Melbourne's full liability estimate of $584 billion over the years to 2030, so that we don't pass this cost entirely onto future generations. Alternatively, we can change policies and commit to working with the world to prevent heating above 1.5 degrees Celsius. This would obviate the need to include the $584 billion, and we could instead include a mere $35 billion to cover the cost of liability for damages that, according to Melbourne Uni, is still unavoidable. To find out more about this, viewers may like to watch Episode 6, Part 2 of ACFP's YouTube videocast series on the state of Australia in 2020. This is about climate change and how we can still avoid these unaffordable costs if we take a leadership stance on the world stage to prevent global heating. On top of all these things, we would need to include a reasonable contingency for any as yet unforeseen risks, such as a rise in interest rates on our national debt, and we would need to include any other essential costs. All of that taken together forms what I will call our base budget. The focus here is to help Australians understand the minimum public expenditures necessary to prevent a decline from our current living standard, This is not to suggest that the current standard is acceptable, it's just a starting point. As such, Treasury would need to prepare an additional estimate of the cost to bridge any gap between the current service levels and the minimum preferred standard of living suggested by the community's plan. For instance, if the community wished to provide affordable access for every child to at least a year of preschool education, and the current provisions are insufficient for that, then we should include an estimate to bridge the gap. We would also have to do the same, for instance, for any insufficient funding for essential asset maintenance. So, Treasury should comb through our plan to find where the essentials aren't funded and include a cost estimate for them. All this could be shown graphically so that the community can see what it will cost us to keep what we have now in service levels and what the gap is to bring the service standard up to the preferred levels for our quality of life in each of the main areas of our expenditure. Graphically, that could be presented to the community something like this, showing the funding level we have for various services now and an estimate of any top-ups required to deliver the preferred service level. For illustrative purposes, I've included a few examples of potential top-ups in areas where people have been complaining of underfunded service delivery and cutbacks, like in Medicare rebates. The estimated top-ups are represented in the orange bars in the graph. I'm just using rough estimates of potential top-ups, but in terms of amounts needed to bridge the gap between current service levels and demand for services, these are not unrealistic estimates. In effect, this process establishes what I call floor expenditure levels. By that I mean the minimum amount of spending that is required to reach and maintain the acceptable degree of wellbeing and security for every Australian. It's the sum of the blue and orange bars in the graph. National IP&R can thereby give Australians the first opportunity they have ever had to set the service levels they're prepared to pay for from their taxes, but with a degree of comfort that they will not be underfunding their needs. The floor expenditure level is something about which we must be open and honest with ourselves. It's something no federal or state government has ever wanted to disclose, but it's in our financial interest to know what it is and make sure we fund it. Drop below it, and we lose essential services and with it our standard of living. Drop below it, and we also start stacking up unfair and unaffordable bills for future generations. For example, we delay necessary expenditures on asset maintenance, which means assets deteriorate to the point where it costs our kids much more to fix them than it would have if we had maintained them on time. Drop below it, and we deplete other types of capital assets like the intelligence of our workforce, again, costing ourselves more than we save. Drop below it, and we deplete our capacity to respond to emergencies like pandemics, wildfires, and the death of the Great Barrier Reef. By knowing what the floor is for each aspect of our services, we can also get a clear idea of the total amount of revenue we will need to raise to fund services at the floor level or above it if we wish. The floor expenditure level, based on truthful disclosure over what it will really cost to deliver an acceptable level of wellbeing and security, constitutes the basis of a new contract with governments that spend our taxes. It reverses the permission system for taxation. Instead of allowing our governments unilaterally and thoughtlessly to make decisions to reduce the total tax take, the floor expenditure disclosure allows us to set the minimum funding levels. The government's job is thereby converted from being one where, without our permission, they cut services to compensate for loss of taxation revenues, to one where they must demonstrate that they have protected services and have sought out the best ways for equitably distributing the tax burden and or reducing that burden by utilising sources of public funds other than taxation. Here again, National IP&R helps them out. Once we have a handle on the preferred service levels and floor expenditures, we can move on to stage 2, where we can estimate any revenue shortfalls. Using this example, Had we done this starting in 2018-19, we would have been able to identify that our preferred service level top-ups might cost us, say, another 50 billion, and that we would therefore have needed another 56 billion in revenue in that particular year to cover the full cost. 56 billion might seem like a lot, but in reality, this could have been funded quite easily if we had not granted ourselves over 300 billion in tax cuts over the 10 years to 2029, as we did in 2019. That would have given us another 30 billion a year. The rest could be gathered from a range of sources, including from profitable government trading enterprises and from full employment programs, which expand the numbers of people who can then build the nation's coffers by paying tax, while simultaneously reducing unemployment costs, a double gain. We could also cover the shortfalls from savings like cessation of fossil fuel subsidies and from reduction of inefficient operation of government services. Inefficiency which mostly arises these days from poor operation of public services by the rent-seeking private sector. The private sector has taken over much of our service operation in the last 20 years, but we haven't saved a cent. Quite the opposite. And the nation's productivity has dropped significantly. There is a multitude of ways that we can cleverly and securely finance our preferred future quality of life if we give ourselves the chance. And that's what we do in stage 3. With this sort of information and the choices laid out so that everyone who's keen to participate can see what those choices are, we have the basis for a decent conversation about how we prefer to structure the nation's income sources, including our own taxation, and how we prefer to share the wealth we raise. Treasury analysts can set out the potential new income we can raise by each option, and they can test the impact on people in every tax bracket. We can then choose the fairest and most reliable way to share the burden of paying for services vital to our lifestyle and economic growth. In particular, we can work out how we're going to share it across generations. If we do this well, we'll be the first generation able to show that we did not rob our children, that we shared bills as fairly as we could. We will also be able to show them that we didn't impose completely unnecessary costs on them. This is because long-term financial planning in National IP&R also gives us the gift of advance notice about costs we can avoid. In the case of the older generation in the 2020s, we have already quantified the biggest of those known avoidable costs, climate change. And the long-term financial planning process with open community involvement can help us head off that cost. It gives us a chance to assess the possibility of savings. We can see what our costs will be just to maintain our existing levels of service over the next 10 years, although we must remember that quality of life with this service level will still decline. So on top of that, we need to show what it will cost us in the future years to increase service levels so that we maintain or improve our quality of life. On to that, we can add our contingency to cover risk and new assets. But then we ought to add the known cost to Australia if the world fails to cap global heating at 1.5 degrees. We need to put provisions aside for this now. After all, we can hardly expect our children to bear it. They'll have enough trouble coping with the extra costs of climate change between 2030 and 2050. In all fairness, that cost of $584 billion by 2030, identified by Melbourne Uni, should be borne by us in this decade. After all, it was we who created the problem. However, with long-term financial planning, we get the chance to head off the problem and make sure that neither we nor our children will need to take that cost on at all. We can wipe it out almost entirely because Melbourne Uni has, after all, identified that if we take a leadership role and work with the world immediately to stop global heating, the cost to Australia will add a mere $35 billion by 2030. That's the total of now unavoidable costs we've built up by our inaction on climate change over the last decade. So we needn't expose ourselves to the full $584 billion at all. We can avoid all but a fraction of it if we change our policies on climate now. Long-term financial planning lets us know ahead of time how much we will save, and it's a lot more than it will cost us to meet the temperature targets. This sort of information is rarely shared with Australians by federal governments. On the contrary, many seek electoral advantages by obscuring it. When the leader of the National Party, Barnaby Joyce, said he wouldn't back action on climate change before seeing the cost, he was actively obscuring the known answer. It will cost Australia about $35 billion by 2030 to keep temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, but a minimum of $584 billion if we do nothing. The information is there, and with long-term financial planning, it can be shared with Australians in an easily understood form. This is what I meant when I said at the start of this element that long-term financial planning is also potentially the most rewarding part of National IP&R, if we do it well. All up, we can only come out ahead and with far greater security of services and living standards if we plan our finances. Higher service level standards are affordable with a few easy shifts in the way we manage our finances. And it is a certainty that if we don't shift over to this new way of preparing our plans, we can kiss our services goodbye. If we expose ourselves to that $584 billion cost of inaction on top of the debt we've taken on for the pandemic, it's game over for our services and the standard of living we have enjoyed over the last few decades. To do this effectively, some significant cultural changes are required within the ranks of the federal public service itself. This is an entirely new way for the Federal Treasury to work with Australians. It's bottom-driven nation building, not an imposition of a limited menu from the top down. For this reason, in the first years of national integrated planning and reporting, if we can get it going within our democracy, it may be that this role I've described for Treasury may be better done by well-equipped independent institutions such as a university or through the formation of a new special unit within an institution that is accountable to the Parliament rather than the government of the day. That institution is probably the Parliamentary Budget Office. These institutional questions are yet to be resolved, and we might expect that there will be resistance to this sort of reform, particularly from governments that currently enjoy more authoritarian control of budgets and much prefer Australians to be silent on policy such as the Morrison government. But regardless of this, we can still concentrate on building a stronger and stronger National Integrated Community Futures Plan, and we can use that to gradually build up our influence in our democracy. We can use it to create a much more constructive relationship with elected leaders and guide them about where we want the nation to go and how. For that, we need to utilise the remaining 3 elements of National IP&R. Element 6, open and transparent comment channels. Element 7, the Australia Together National Wellbeing Index. And Element 8, the end of term report. In the next and last part of this episode, part 3, I'll set out how these elements work. Thanks for watching this episode. If you like this program, please click like on the YouTube page and share the program with your friends and subscribe to this channel.